Margaret Hayes stood at the church entrance, her ivory lace gown flowing around her like a gentle cloud. And this was supposed to be her day of new beginnings. But Richard, her fiancé of 2 years, hadn't arrived. The guests whispered softly in the pews. Margaret's sister, Patricia, touched her arm gently. "Maybe there's traffic," she said, though they both knew better. 20 minutes passed, then 40. Margaret felt the familiar weight of disappointment settling on her shoulders, the same feeling she'd carried through so many years of near misses and almosts. She'd raised her daughter alone after her first husband passed away. She'd built a good life, a quiet life. And when Richard came along with his smooth words and promises, she dared to hope again. Father Michaels, the elderly priest who'd known Margaret since childhood, approached her carefully. "My dear," he said softly, "I'm so sorry." Margaret looked at the faces in the church. Her neighbors, her friends from the library where she worked, her daughter Emily, who'd flown in from Seattle. They'd all come to celebrate with her. She thought of the reception hall, decorated with simple white roses, the modest cake she'd ordered from the bakery downtown. "I'm sorry, too," she whispered, mostly to herself. That's when she noticed him. Thomas Reed sat alone in the last pew, wearing worn jeans and a faded work shirt that had seen better days. His hair was a bit too long, touching his collar, and his face carried the kind of weathered look that came from working outdoors. He was the church handyman, the man who fixed the leaking roof last spring and repaired the organ pipes. Margaret had seen him around, always polite, always quiet. Something in Margaret shifted. Maybe it was the kindness in his eyes as he looked at her. Maybe it was simply exhaustion from disappointment. Or maybe, at 53, she'd finally learned that life rarely went according to plan, and sometimes you just had to embrace the absurdity of it all. She walked down the aisle, her steps steady despite everything. Thomas stood as she approached, confusion crossing his gentle features. "Thomas," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the church, "would you consider doing me an enormous favor?" He blinked. "Ma'am, would you marry me? Right now, today?" The church fell completely silent. Patricia gasped. But Margaret kept her eyes on Thomas, this kind man who'd always treated her with quiet respect during their brief interactions at church functions. Thomas studied her face for a long moment. He saw something there, something beyond the fancy dress and the decorated church. He saw a woman who'd been hurt but was still standing, a woman who'd decided to choose differently. "Are you certain?" he asked gently. "I'm tired of waiting for the perfect moment," Margaret said. "I'm tired of perfect plans that fall apart. You're a good man, Thomas. I've seen how you help people, how you care for this church. That matters more than I realized." Thomas smiled then, slow and genuine. "Well," he said, "I've never been called perfect, but I do try to be decent. If you're sure, then yes. I'd be honored. Father Michaels married them right there," his voice trembling slightly with emotion. Emily cried in the front pew, but she was smiling too. The reception went forward, and if the guests were confused, they were also charmed by the unexpected turn of events. Over cake, Thomas told Margaret about his work. He fixed things, not just at the church, but all over town. He helped elderly Mrs. Chen with her plumbing. He rebuilt old Mr. Peterson's front steps for free. He lived simply in a small apartment above his workshop. "I don't have much," he said honestly. "I hope you understand that." Margaret thought about Richard's expensive suits, his luxury car, his empty promises. "You're here," she said. "That's more than enough." They settled into married life with surprising ease. Thomas moved into Margaret's comfortable but modest home. He fixed the kitchen cabinet that had been sticking for months. He planted tomatoes in her neglected garden. They developed routines together, comfortable rhythms of morning coffee and evening walks. 3 months later, Margaret learned the truth quite by accident. She'd needed to reach Thomas at work, and when she called the number he'd given her, a professional secretary answered, "Reed Foundation? How may I direct your call?" The Reed Foundation, it turned out, was one of the largest charitable organizations in the state. Thomas's grandfather had made a fortune in manufacturing, and Thomas had inherited it all when he turned 30. But he'd chosen to live differently. He'd set up the foundation, donating most of his wealth to causes he believed in, keeping only enough to live comfortably. His workshop was actually the foundation office. His fixing things around town was identifying people in need and helping them through anonymous, donations, or personal assistance. When Margaret confronted him that evening, Thomas looked embarrassed. "I was going to tell you," he said. I like that you married me without knowing. You saw me for who I am, not what I have." Margaret sat down heavily. "You let me think you were poor." "I am poor in the ways that matter to most people," Thomas said quietly. "I don't own fancy things. I don't live in a mansion. The money, it's meant to help others, not impress anyone." Margaret thought about this for a long time. She thought about Richard, who'd always valued appearances. She thought about her own assumptions, how she'd believed. Thomas's worth lay in his kindness rather than his bank account, and how that belief had actually been true. "You're right," she said finally. "You are who you are." "And I married that man. Do you regret it?" Thomas asked, vulnerability showing through his usual calm. Margaret smiled, really smiled. Not for a single moment. They continued their quiet life together. The money didn't change things because they'd never built their relationship on material concerns. Margaret kept working at the library because she loved it. Thomas kept helping people because that's who he was. They grew old together, in the gentle way of people who'd found each other late but just in time. Years later, when Emily visited with Margaret's grandchildren, she'd watch her mother and Thomas in the garden, laughing over some shared joke, and she'd think about how her mother's canceled wedding had actually been the beginning of something real. Sometimes the best moments in life aren't the ones we plan. Sometimes they're the ones we're brave enough to embrace when everything else falls apart. And sometimes kindness and authenticity matter more than any fortune. Though having both, Margaret would say with a wink, certainly didn't hurt.